In the shadows of Europe's grand history, a dynasty quietly shaped the continent, its name whispered in fragments, its deeds recorded in half-truths. The Merovingians, the long-haired kings of the Franks, ruled over Gaul with an authority that blended bloodline, ritual, and secrecy. To the casual observer, they were distant, eccentric rulers. To those who understood the signs, they were custodians of a sacred legacy, their power as much spiritual as temporal. From the rise of Clovis to the enigmatic later kings, the Merovingians mastered a form of governance unseen in the annals of history. Their hair, long and uncut, was not mere vanity. It was a crown, a signal of divine right and continuity. Sacred rituals, hidden symbols, and secret alliances reinforced their authority, while the broader world only glimpsed the surface. This documentary explores the hidden world of these kings, their mysticism, their secret knowledge, and the artifacts that may still carry their power. We will journey through battles, alliances, and sacred rituals, peeling back the layers of myth and history to uncover a dynasty that was both ruler and legend. The Merovingians were more than kings. They were a living symbol of authority, mystery, and continuity, a dynasty whose influence resonates quietly through the ages, waiting to be rediscovered. The Merovingians rose in a Europe fractured by the collapse of Rome, where tribes vied for survival and old structures of authority lay in ruins. The Franks, once a collection of disparate tribes along the Rhine, began consolidating power under leaders who understood both war and symbolism. It was a chaotic world where strength alone could not secure lasting authority. Legitimacy, perception, and ritual mattered just as much. The dynasty claimed descent from the semi-mythical Merovec, linking their rule to divine favor. Early kings like Childeric and Clovis navigated alliances with other tribes, negotiated with the church, and maintained loyalty through marriage, gifts, and subtle intimidation. Their long hair, sacred rituals, and ceremonial objects marked them as different, their authority inherited and mystical rather than granted by conquest alone. This period also witnessed the transformation of Europe's cultural landscape. Roman traditions clashed with Germanic customs, pagan rituals merged with emerging Christianity, and the Merovingians positioned themselves as intermediaries between worlds, visible leaders on the battlefield and symbolic custodians of sacred knowledge. They were at once conquerors, politicians, and mystics, creating a foundation for a dynasty whose influence extended far beyond the borders of their kingdom, hidden in plain sight from those who failed to recognize the signs. Long hair defined the Merovingians. It was more than style, it was authority, inheritance, and sacred power woven into their very being. Observers noted it with fascination. Kings whose hair flowed like banners in battle, signaling legitimacy that no crown could match. Hair in Celtic and Germanic tradition was strength. In Merovingian culture, it was a living symbol of divine right. The king's appearance reinforced their mystique. Jewelry, coins, and ceremonial garments carried coded messages, and burial practices ensured that sacred symbols accompanied rulers even in death. Their hair separated them from ordinary kings, marking them as chosen, divinely favored, and part of a lineage that connected them to forces beyond the visible. This physical symbolism extended into governance. Presence, gesture, and ritual reinforced their authority. Their power was as psychological and spiritual as it was political. Even contemporaries who dismissed their eccentricities could not deny their influence. The Merovingians understood that perception could be a tool of control, and they wielded it expertly, creating a dynasty whose legacy endures in legend, symbols, and the quiet echoes of history. Beneath the surface of conquest, diplomacy, and ceremony, the Merovingians carried secrets that were whispered only in shadows, preserved in symbols, and hinted at in the artifacts they left behind. They were more than kings. They were custodians of knowledge that transcended the ordinary chronicles of history, a hidden layer of power that intertwined politics, mysticism, and the sacred. In the forests, rivers, and stone halls of early medieval Europe, a subtle form of authority thrived, one that was invisible to outsiders, yet potent enough to shape kingdoms and influence the course of history. The mysticism of the Merovingians was not accidental. Their lineage, long celebrated and carefully guarded, carried traditions inherited from Roman, Celtic, and perhaps even earlier European cultures. These traditions spoke of the sacred nature of kingship, of power that was not merely political but spiritual. A king's legitimacy, they believed, was bound to ritual, to sacred objects, and to ancestral knowledge passed silently from one generation to the next. It was a framework of authority that could not be challenged by force alone, for it existed beyond the reach of armies or alliances. To challenge a Merovingian king, therefore, was not merely a political act. It was an affront to a sacred order that intertwined the human and the divine. Artifacts associated with the Merovingians hint at the depth of this hidden knowledge. Coins, jewelry, weapons, and ceremonial objects were often inscribed with symbols whose meaning has been lost or deliberately obscured. Some of these symbols bear resemblance to ancient geomantic patterns, astrological signs, or even what later occult traditions would recognize as alchemical or mystical imagery. Every object, no matter how small, carried multiple layers of meaning, reinforcing the king's authority while signaling a deeper knowledge to those attuned to the codes. In this way, the Merovingians communicated a silent language, one that only the initiated could interpret. Perhaps the most compelling aspect of their mysticism lies in the stories of sacred relics. Legends speak of objects imbued with power, from chalices that held the essence of the divine to stones and artifacts preserved as conduits of spiritual authority. Some tales suggest that the Merovingians guarded these relics jealously, their presence legitimizing rule and connecting the dynasty to a sacred, almost cosmic order. In some accounts, the kings themselves were vessels for this power, their long hair and bloodlines acting as links in an unbroken chain of spiritual authority. Whether fact, allegory, or a combination of both, these stories create the sense of a dynasty operating on a plane far above the mundane concerns of taxation, war, or law. Astrology and celestial observation also played a subtle role in Merovingian life. Ancient sources suggest that certain decisions, battles, and rituals were timed according to the stars, lunar cycles, or celestial alignments. This was more than superstition. It was an inherited practice connecting kingship with the rhythms of the natural and spiritual worlds. By observing and interpreting these patterns, the Merovingians aligned themselves with forces that transcended ordinary perception, blending leadership with an esoteric awareness that remains largely invisible in the historical record. Even the chroniclers who recorded their reigns could glimpse only fragments of these practices. Monks, Romanized historians, and clerics documented battles, treaties, and ceremonies, yet rarely captured the depth of ritual, symbolism, or hidden knowledge that underpinned the dynasty's authority. Their accounts often dismiss what they could not understand, reducing sacred acts to mere superstition or labeling symbolic gestures as eccentricities. In doing so, they inadvertently preserve the mystery, leaving future generations with tantalizing gaps and enigmatic traces. These gaps have fueled centuries of speculation, from medieval mystics to modern researchers seeking to uncover what the official histories conceal. Religious influence further deepened the Merovingians' mystique. While outwardly aligned with the Christian Church, there are indications that their understanding of spirituality was far more complex and nuanced than the official record suggests. Some scholars argue that the Merovingians maintained older, pre-Christian traditions alongside their Christian faith, blending pagan rituals with emerging ecclesiastical authority. In this synthesis, kingship became a bridge between the ancient and the new, the earthly and the divine, allowing the Merovingians to operate in a space where ordinary rulers could not venture. Their power was thus both political and sacred, grounded in visible authority, yet extending into realms largely hidden from public view. One of the most enduring mysteries involves their alleged knowledge of secret texts. Medieval and later sources speak of codices, scrolls, and manuscripts that contained wisdom too dangerous or sacred for common eyes. Some of these texts were said to preserve prophetic visions, historical truths, and instructions for maintaining dynastic power. Others were purportedly linked to esoteric practices, spiritual alchemy, or methods of accessing hidden realms of knowledge. While few of these texts have survived or have been openly acknowledged, the very notion that they existed points to a dynasty deeply engaged with knowledge beyond what ordinary kings could access. Symbolism permeated even the mundane aspects of life. Jewelry, attire, banners, and coins often incorporated motifs that encoded messages about legitimacy, divine favor, or ancestral authority. The Merovingians understood that power could be communicated silently, through signs and symbols that spoke louder than words. A crown was one thing, the subtle arrangement of a ceremonial garment, the positioning of a gemstone, the choice of a ritual site. These were all deliberate acts of authority, reinforcing the king's sacred role in ways largely invisible to the casual observer. Some modern researchers and occult historians speculate that the Merovingians' esoteric knowledge extended to areas we might now consider mystical or even forbidden. Certain legends suggest connections to the Holy Grail, secret bloodlines, or rituals that preserve the dynasty's spiritual potency across generations. Others posit that their understanding of power included hidden networks, alliances, and codes of conduct designed to maintain influence beyond the public eye. Whether myth or reality, these theories highlight the enduring fascination with a dynasty that operated in layers, some visible, many deliberately concealed. The cumulative effect of these mysteries is profound. The Merovingians were rulers who understood the world not only through conquest or diplomacy, but through subtlety, symbols, and secrets. Their power was multifaceted, political, spiritual, and psychological. Their kingship was both performance and reality, a constant interplay of what could be seen and what must remain hidden. To appreciate their authority is to recognize that true power often resides not in spectacle alone, but in knowledge, in ritual, and in the careful orchestration of perception. As we continue to uncover the Merovingian story, we see that their mysticism was not an accessory. It was the foundation of their rule. The long-haired kings, the sacred artifacts, the celestial observances, the coded symbols. All of these elements created a system of authority that was almost impervious to external understanding. Even centuries later, we are left piecing together fragments, interpreting artifacts, and listening for the echoes of a tradition that deliberately thrived in shadows. In exploring these hidden layers, we gain insight not only into the dynasty itself, but into the way history can conceal as much as it reveals. The Merovingians operated in a world where the ordinary and the extraordinary intersected, and their legacy reminds us that the surface of history is rarely the full story. Beneath the recorded events lies a deeper reality, a dynasty that mastered both the visible and invisible realms, shaping Europe through knowledge, symbolism, and a quiet, almost imperceptible power that endures in legend and lore to this day. While the Merovingians cultivated an aura of mysticism and sacred authority, their true power was equally grounded in politics, a subtle, intricate web of influence that extended far beyond battles and treaties. In a Europe still reeling from the collapse of Rome, survival required cunning, strategy, and the ability to wield both visible and invisible forces. The Merovingians understood this perfectly. They navigated the chaotic landscape not solely through armies, but through alliances, marriages, loyalty networks, and manipulation of emerging institutions, creating a form of power that was both resilient and elusive. From the earliest days, the Merovingians demonstrated an uncanny ability to turn rivals into instruments of their rule. Tribal chieftains, local rulers, and even other Frankish factions were drawn into a delicate dance of allegiance and obligation. A marriage could unite warring tribes, a gift could secure loyalty, and a subtle threat or public display could enforce obedience without bloodshed. Every act, every gesture, was calculated to maintain control while appearing natural or divinely ordained. In this way, the Merovingians governed not just through force, but through perception, a mastery of influence that left many contemporaries bewildered and historians puzzled centuries later. Their relationship with the Church illustrates this duality perfectly. While outwardly embracing Christianity, the Merovingians often used the institution to reinforce their own legitimacy, while carefully ensuring that the Church did not completely dominate their authority. Clovis conversion is often portrayed as a simple alignment with the rising power of the Church, but beneath the surface lay a more sophisticated understanding. By positioning themselves as divinely favored yet independent rulers, the Merovingians created a delicate balance. They benefited from the Church's moral and social authority while subtly controlling its influence, using religious structures to consolidate power and maintain their sacred mystique. Political intrigue was a constant in Merovingian courts. Councils and meetings were arenas where alliances were tested, promises were weighed against betrayal, and subtle gestures could determine the fate of entire regions. Kings relied on advisors, kin, and trusted envoys to manage these delicate networks. Yet even these trusted agents were often bound by ritual, oath, and secrecy, ensuring that loyalty was both profound and enforceable. The dynasty's survival depended not only on the strength of arms, but on the meticulous cultivation of trust, fear, and respect in equal measure. Internal conflict within the dynasty itself further demonstrates their mastery of hidden influence. Succession disputes, rival branches of the family, and competing claims to power were handled not only through overt confrontations, but through subtle negotiations, strategic marriages, and, at times, ruthless elimination. The so-called do-nothing kings of later Merovingian history were often anything but powerless. Their public inaction masked a sophisticated system of behind-the-scenes governance. While chroniclers lamented their inactivity, it is possible that these kings exercised authority through covert networks, ensuring that the dynasty's influence persisted even when it appeared diminished. The Merovingians also understood the psychological dimensions of power. Rituals, ceremonies, and symbols were leveraged to impress both subjects and rivals, creating an aura that could inspire loyalty, fear, or awe at a distance. The mere presence of a king, crowned by long hair and adorned in carefully chosen garments, was a statement that extended beyond the visible. Allies might see protection and legitimacy. Rivals might sense an intangible advantage that could not be countered by armies alone. Power, for the Merovingians, was as much about perception as it was about reality, and they were masters at shaping how they were seen. Wars were fought, of course, but even these were often orchestrated with strategic subtlety. Campaigns were carefully timed, alliances secured in advance, and outcomes influenced not only by the strength of soldiers, but by negotiation, intimidation, and the manipulation of rival factions. Battles were as much displays of calculated influence as they were clashes of swords. By combining force with diplomacy, the Merovingians created a system of dominance that was both visible and invisible, overt and covert, ensuring that their dynasty remained resilient even in periods of apparent weakness. Rival dynasties and foreign powers frequently underestimated the Merovingians, misreading their strategy as ineffectiveness or hesitation. But what appeared to outsiders as passivity was often deliberate, a long game designed to consolidate influence without unnecessary exposure. By remaining partially obscured, by allowing only fragments of their plans to be seen, the Merovingians maintained flexibility and ensured that their authority could adapt to changing circumstances. It was a strategy that combined patience, cunning, and a profound understanding of human behavior, a kind of political mysticism grounded in real-world results. Even the common people were touched by the subtle exercise of power. Rituals, public ceremonies, and symbols of kingship reinforced social hierarchies and expectations of loyalty. Festivals, religious observances, and military parades were carefully choreographed to project authority, legitimacy, and divine favor. In a society where literacy was rare, these performances conveyed messages as effectively as any written decree, embedding the king's power in the very consciousness of the populace. The Merovingians understood that influence could flow not only from laws and armies, but from culture, ceremony, and the careful shaping of perception. Intrigue extended beyond the borders of the Frankish realm. Diplomatic relationships with neighboring tribes, kingdoms, and emerging powers were constantly managed through a combination of gifts, marriages, oaths, and subtle intimidation. Envoys and ambassadors acted as extensions of the king's will, carrying messages that were as much about symbolism as substance. In this way, the Merovingians projected authority far beyond the territories they directly controlled, weaving a web of influence that ensured their presence and legacy endured in ways that were rarely visible to chroniclers or historians. Perhaps most striking is the sense that the Merovingians' political power was inseparable from their mystical identity. Their long hair, their sacred relics, and their rituals were not just aesthetic or symbolic. They were instruments of authority, reinforcing networks, alliances, and loyalty. The political and spiritual aspects of their kingship were fused, creating a form of governance that was both extraordinary and subtle. Even when their reigns seemed weakened, or when chroniclers labeled them do-nothing kings, the dynasty's influence persisted, hidden in plain sight and supported by systems of trust, ritual, and perception that were invisible to outsiders. In reflecting on these networks of power, it becomes clear that the Merovingians were more than rulers. They were orchestrators of a hidden order. They wielded influence through symbols, ceremony, alliances, and secrecy, creating a system of governance that combined the tangible and intangible in ways that few dynasties before or since have mastered. Their courts were laboratories of power, where human behavior, loyalty, fear, and devotion were studied, guided, and subtly controlled. To rule as a Merovingian was to command not only armies, but the hearts, minds, and perceptions of allies, enemies, and subjects alike. As we trace the threads of this hidden influence, we see a dynasty that mastered both the obvious and the invisible. The Merovingians ruled with subtlety and sophistication, creating a legacy that was deliberately obscured in official histories, but preserved in symbols, rituals, and artifacts. Their story reminds us that the true measure of power is not always visible, and that influence often flows through unseen channels, shaping history quietly, persistently, and sometimes imperceptibly. The Merovingians' political genius was inseparable from their mystique, a dynasty whose authority was at once ceremonial, psychological, and profoundly strategic, leaving a legacy that continues to inspire curiosity and speculation centuries later. Whispers of the Holy Grail have echoed through centuries, carried in legend, song, and clandestine texts, and at the heart of these whispers lies the enigmatic connection to the Merovingians. To the casual historian, the Grail is a myth, a chalice of legend, a symbol of divine favor, or a fantastical object in medieval romances. Yet, for those who follow the traces of hidden dynasties, the Merovingians are more than mere kings. They're often portrayed as guardians of sacred bloodlines, custodians of a mysterious knowledge that may have been intertwined with the Grail itself. This connection, while never conclusively proven, has fueled centuries of speculation, whispered theories, and tantalizing mysteries that blur the line between history and allegory. The Grail, in its many forms, represents more than a cup or vessel. In the medieval imagination, it is a symbol of divine authority, spiritual perfection, and sometimes secret knowledge. Some interpretations suggest that it is a repository of wisdom, a conduit between the earthly and the divine, or even a symbol of sacred bloodlines. Within this framework, the Merovingians are not just rulers, but part of a lineage that claims continuity with a hidden, higher authority. To their contemporaries, such ideas would have been obscure or heretical. To modern mystics and researchers, they form the foundation of a narrative where kingship, bloodline, and sacred relics intersect in ways that challenge the conventional historical record. Legends surrounding the Merovingians hint that their bloodline itself was considered sacred. Some medieval documents, particularly those later popularized in esoteric and occult circles, suggest that the Merovingians were descendants of a divine or semi-divine source. This idea, while sensational, is consistent with the symbolic weight the dynasty placed on ritual, ancestry, and physical markers such as their long hair. If their lineage was indeed viewed as carrying a kind of spiritual authority, then the connection to the Grail takes on a profound significance. The Grail is not merely an object, but a representation of their bloodline's sacred continuity, an emblem of the power they wielded quietly and invisibly. The Dossier's Secrets, a series of controversial 20th-century documents, further fueled speculation by claiming that the Merovingians were connected to hidden Grail traditions preserved by secret societies. According to these claims, the dynasty's spiritual authority was deliberately obscured, maintained through secrecy, and transmitted across generations. Whether these documents are historically reliable or elaborate forgeries, they reveal the persistent fascination with the idea that the Merovingians were more than political rulers. They were custodians of sacred mysteries. Their story becomes a bridge between historical fact, symbolic truth, and the human desire to uncover hidden meaning. Grail legends often place the object in the hands of those who are both royal and spiritually attuned. In this context, the Merovingians' mystical and symbolic practices, their long hair, and their sacred rituals align with the archetype of a Grail-guarding dynasty. The idea is not that they possess the Grail as a physical cup, necessarily, but that their bloodline and kingship functioned as a living Grail, a vessel of spiritual authority, divine right, and hidden wisdom. The Grail, then, becomes a metaphor for the dynasty itself, a symbol of continuity and sacred influence that endures through secrecy and ritual. Medieval romances and chronicles provide tantalizing hints, though often in allegorical form. Tales of knights, quests, and miraculous relics sometimes intersect with the narrative of the Merovingians, suggesting a persistent cultural memory of a sacred lineage intertwined with divine authority. These stories, while fictionalized for contemporary audiences, reflect deeper currents of belief that certain dynasties, through ancestry, ritual, and secrecy, carried knowledge or authority that ordinary rulers could not possess. In this sense, the Grail legend and the Merovingian legacy are intertwined, forming a narrative that resonates across centuries and invites endless exploration. Some researchers point to specific artifacts, burial practices, and royal insignia as indirect evidence of this Grail connection. Chalices, ceremonial vessels, and even certain manuscript illustrations contain symbols reminiscent of Grail lore or sacred geometries associated with divine kingship. These artifacts, scattered across Europe, suggest a continuity of ritual and symbolism that extends beyond mere coincidence. The Merovingians' careful preservation of such objects hints at a deliberate maintenance of spiritual and symbolic authority, reinforcing the notion that their power was as much esoteric as it was political. The Grail connection also feeds into modern theories of secret societies and hidden knowledge. If the Merovingians were indeed guardians of sacred bloodlines or spiritual authority, then their legacy could have influenced later mystical or esoteric traditions, from the Templars to Freemasonry and beyond. Many of these organizations, whether real or imagined, are said to preserve the memory of hidden truths and sacred relics, often tied to dynasties that were quietly erased or obscured from mainstream history. The Merovingians, in this framework, are not simply ancient kings. They're the originators of a silent lineage of wisdom, encoded in symbols, rituals, and stories. Yet, despite centuries of speculation, the Grail connection remains tantalizingly elusive. Historians argue that there is no direct evidence linking the Merovingians to any specific Grail artifact, and much of what exists falls into the realm of myth and allegory. But perhaps that is precisely the point. The power of the Merovingians, their mystique, and their enduring fascination lies in the interplay between what is visible and what is hidden, between recorded history and whispered legend. The Grail, like the dynasty itself, functions as a symbol, a reminder that some truths are never fully revealed, that influence and authority can persist through mystery and secrecy. The allure of the Grail also underscores the broader cultural impact of the Merovingians. Their legacy, real or imagined, has inspired countless storytellers, mystics, and researchers to probe the shadows of history. From medieval poets to modern conspiracy theorists, the narrative of a sacred dynasty guarding hidden knowledge resonates with a deep, almost archetypal human fascination. The idea that some lineage, some secret, carries power beyond ordinary perception. In this sense, the Grail is not just a relic, but a narrative lens through which the Merovingians' enduring mystique can be understood and appreciated. In contemplating the Grail and the Merovingians together, we begin to see the dynasty not merely as rulers of land, but as custodians of an idea, a symbol, and a hidden authority that persists across time. They remind us that power can be subtle, that influence can be hidden in plain sight, and that history often contains layers that are only visible to those who look closely. The Grail, then, is less a tangible object and more a reflection of the dynasty's profound capacity to combine ritual, bloodline, and secrecy into a form of authority that transcends ordinary understanding. The stories, the legends, and the theories all converge to create a sense of wonder, that the Merovingians were not simply historical kings, but participants in a broader, more mysterious order of power. They were rulers who understood the subtle interplay of perception, myth, and reality, whose influence may have been encoded in bloodlines, symbols, and secret rituals. The Grail, whether literal or metaphorical, serves as a lens through which this hidden authority can be glimpsed, revealing a dynasty whose true power has always been just out of reach of ordinary history, visible only to those who seek beyond the surface. Through this lens, the Merovingians and the Grail together form a narrative of enduring intrigue, a dynasty that straddled the line between history and legend, whose sacred authority was veiled in symbols, rituals, and secrecy. Whether one views the Grail as a literal object, a metaphor for sacred bloodlines, or a symbol of hidden knowledge, the connection reinforces the central truth of the Merovingians, that their power was never merely political, but mystical, symbolic, and profoundly enduring, leaving echoes that continue to captivate our imagination to this day. Clovis I stands at the center of the Merovingian story, a figure both legendary and historical, whose rise transformed the fragile landscape of post-Roman Gaul into the foundation of a kingdom that would endure for centuries. He was not born into immediate power. Rather, He inherited a legacy of fragmented tribes, ancient customs, and uncertain loyalties. Yet Clovis' ambition, strategy, and perception of sacred kingship propelled him beyond the expectations of his contemporaries. In him, the Merovingian legacy of mysticism, ritual, and subtle authority found its most potent expression, a ruler whose actions would echo through history, both in what was recorded and in what was deliberately obscured. The early years of Clovis' reign were marked by careful consolidation. He faced a patchwork of Frankish tribes, each with its own chieftains, customs, and ambitions. Unlike many rulers who relied purely on force to command loyalty, Clovis employed a combination of diplomacy, strategic marriages, and calculated displays of power. He understood that authority was not only demonstrated through victory in battle, but also through perception, allegiance, and the careful orchestration of loyalty. Every decision, from alliances to treaties, was imbued with an understanding of both human psychology and sacred symbolism, a reflection of the Merovingian approach to kingship that had been refined over generations. Clovis' military campaigns were notable not just for their success, but for their subtlety and timing. He expanded Frankish territory with precision, often striking when rival factions were weakened or divided. Legends describe him as both decisive and cunning, a leader whose victories were as much a product of strategy and diplomacy as of brute force. The king understood that conquest alone did not secure power. It was the careful integration of conquered tribes, the maintenance of loyalty, and the symbolic display of divine favor that ensured a lasting legacy. Clovis' campaigns were thus both martial and psychological, a reflection of a dynasty that blended visible authority with invisible influence. Perhaps the most famous and consequential moment of Clovis' reign was his conversion to Christianity, a turning point that would define not only his rule, but the trajectory of European history. According to legend, he vowed to convert if granted victory in a critical battle, and upon triumph, he was baptized in the Christian faith. On the surface, this act appears as a pragmatic political maneuver, aligning Clovis with the growing power of the Church. Yet beneath this surface lies a more complex reality. Conversion was a ritual act that reinforced sacred authority, cemented legitimacy, and intertwined temporal power with spiritual endorsement. In embracing Christianity, Clovis did not merely adopt a religion. He positioned himself as a king whose authority was sanctioned by both earthly and divine forces, a true custodian of the Merovingian sacred legacy. The symbolism of this conversion cannot be overstated. In a time when kingship was understood as a reflection of divine favor, baptism represented a public acknowledgement of sacred responsibility. Clovis' long hair, ceremonial presence, and rituals were all part of a narrative that merged ancestry, mysticism, and spiritual legitimacy. His baptism was not only a personal act of faith, it was a calculated reinforcement of the Merovingian claim to sacred kingship, signaling to subjects, allies, and rivals alike that his rule was sanctioned by forces beyond the ordinary. Yet Clovis' achievements were not limited to symbolic acts. He was a master of internal consolidation, turning a loose coalition of tribes into a coherent kingdom. He established systems of governance, codified laws, and maintained networks of loyalty that extended beyond the battlefield. His court was a center of both political and mystical authority, where advisors, kin, and envoys participated in rituals that reinforced hierarchy, legitimacy, and influence. These networks allowed Clovis to govern not only through force, but through the subtle control of perception, expectation, and allegiance, a method that would characterize the Merovingians for generations. Clovis also demonstrated a keen understanding of succession and legacy. Unlike rulers who left disputes over inheritance to chance, he worked to secure his dynasty's future, strategically marrying his daughters and sons into influential families and cultivating alliances that would outlast his reign. These decisions reflect a broader Merovingian pattern, the intertwining of family, ritual, and strategy to preserve authority across generations. The dynasty's power was thus not ephemeral. It was carefully preserved in bloodlines, alliances, and the subtle rituals that reinforced their sacred and political legitimacy. Religious and mystical considerations continued to shape Clovis' reign. His alignment with the church did not replace older, sacred traditions. It layered them, creating a fusion of Christian and pre-Christian authority that reinforced his mystique. Chroniclers hint at rituals, ceremonies, and secret practices that reinforced his legitimacy while connecting him to the sacred traditions of his ancestors. Though much of this has been lost or obscured, traces remain in stories of blessings, sacred oaths, and the symbolism embedded in ceremonial objects. Clovis ruled not only as a temporal leader, but as a spiritual figure, embodying the Merovingian belief that kingship was as much about hidden knowledge and sacred authority as it was about visible power. The expansion of the Frankish kingdom under Clovis was both political and cultural. By uniting previously disparate tribes, he laid the groundwork for a cohesive identity, consolidating language, law, and customs in ways that would persist for centuries. Yet even this unification was imbued with symbolic resonance. Each conquest, each alliance, and each integration of new territories carried not only material and strategic value, but also reinforced the sacred and mystical aura of the Merovingian dynasty. Clovis' successes were, in many ways, a demonstration of how spiritual authority and political skill could converge, creating a kingdom that was formidable in both perception and reality. Even in the face of rivals, Clovis exercised a form of power that was quietly manipulative yet profoundly effective. He understood that visible strength alone could not secure loyalty. Fear, respect, ritual, and the subtle demonstration of sacred authority were equally critical. His leadership exemplifies the Merovingian approach to governance, one that blends the tangible and intangible, the political and the mystical, the seen and the unseen. Through this lens, Clovis emerges not simply as a conqueror or administrator, but as the embodiment of a tradition that placed equal weight on ritual, perception, and strategic influence. Clovis' reign also sowed the seeds for centuries of speculation and mystery. Chroniclers of the time, often working from Roman or Christian perspectives, recorded battles, conversions, and treaties, yet left much unsaid about the symbolic, ritual, and mystical dimensions of his kingship. It is in these gaps that the enduring intrigue of the Merovingians resides, suggesting that the most powerful aspects of their rule were deliberately concealed or transmitted quietly through symbols, ceremonies, and lineage. For modern observers, these silences are as revealing as the written record, hinting at a dynasty whose authority was multifaceted, sophisticated, and deeply entwined with the sacred. As we reflect on Clovis' life and reign, it becomes clear that he was more than a historical figure. He was a turning point in the Merovingian legacy, a ruler who synthesized strategy, mysticism, ritual, and diplomacy into a cohesive exercise of power. His actions transformed not only the Frankish kingdom, but the very understanding of kingship in Europe. Clovis demonstrates how the Merovingians combined visible authority with hidden influence, creating a dynasty whose true power often lay beneath the surface in ceremonies, symbols, and the subtle orchestration of loyalty and perception. In understanding Clovis, we begin to understand the essence of the Merovingians, a dynasty that operated in layers, blending politics, mysticism, and strategy into a coherent, enduring system of power. His reign represents both the apex of Merovingian authority and the foundation for the mysteries that would surround the dynasty for centuries. Clovis was not merely a king of his people. He was a custodian of sacred authority, a master of perception, and a silent architect of a legacy that continues to captivate historians, mystics, and storytellers alike. After Clovis, the Merovingian dynasty entered a period often dismissed by historians as the era of the so-called do-nothing kings. These rulers, appearing weak or indifferent in the chronicles, seem to have presided over decline, internal conflict, and the gradual erosion of direct royal power. On the surface, their reigns appear uneventful, a contrast to the decisive and ambitious rule of Clovis. Yet, the Merovingian story, like a carefully folded map, contains hidden layers, and what seems like passivity may conceal a far more sophisticated and deliberate exercise of authority. The term do-nothing is misleading. Contemporary chroniclers, often clerics or Romanized scribes, recorded the apparent inactivity of these kings without understanding the nuances of Merovingian governance. What they saw as idleness could have been a deliberate strategy, a hands-off approach to visible rule that preserved authority in ways that were subtle, quiet, and difficult for outsiders to trace. The Merovingians understood that power could flow invisibly through alliances, loyal intermediaries, ritual observances, and symbolic gestures, and these kings may have mastered the art of ruling without direct action, influencing events from behind a carefully maintained veil of apparent inaction. Much of the dynasty's authority during this period was exercised through family networks. Brothers, cousins, and distant relatives often managed regions and tribal alliances, maintaining continuity and loyalty to the Merovingian line. These networks were carefully monitored and reinforced through rituals, oaths, and symbolic displays of legitimacy. Even if the king appeared disengaged from day-to-day governance, the dynasty's influence persisted through these indirect channels. The perception of weakness, therefore, may have been a strategic camouflage, discouraging rivals while allowing the dynasty to consolidate power quietly. Political marriages were a key instrument of this subtle influence. The do-nothing kings used familial connections to maintain dominance across fractured territories, ensuring loyalty through kinship rather than force. Daughters were married into influential families, sons were placed in positions of authority, and alliances were formed that extended beyond immediate borders. Through these strategic bonds, the Merovingians maintained a web of influence that ensured the dynasty's survival, even as the kings themselves appeared passive. This approach reflects a long-standing Merovingian strategy. True authority was not always visible, but carefully cultivated through subtle, enduring channels. The do-nothing kings also relied heavily on ritual and symbolism to reinforce authority. Ceremonial appearances, religious observances, and the careful maintenance of sacred objects communicated legitimacy to both allies and subjects. Their long hair, crowns, and vestments continued to signal sacred kingship, projecting authority that could not be challenged by outsiders. Even when they delegated power to mayors of the palace, nobles, or regional leaders, these kings remained the symbolic center of a vast, unseen network, a focal point around which loyalty, ritual, and influence revolved. Conflict within the dynasty itself was carefully managed. Succession disputes, rival claims, and internal tensions were handled with a combination of negotiation, ritual, and, at times, calculated elimination. Chroniclers often fail to appreciate the subtlety of these maneuvers, presenting the results as evidence of weakness or chaos. In reality, the Merovingians were experts at preserving the continuity of their line through indirect means, ensuring that their sacred and political authority remained intact even when it appeared dormant. Their power was, in essence, hidden in plain sight. External threats were met with similar subtlety. Tribes, rival kingdoms, and emerging powers may have perceived these kings as ineffectual, but the Merovingians' influence was maintained through diplomacy, strategic alliances, and symbolic gestures. Envoys, oaths, and gifts carried authority in ways that armies alone could not. By avoiding overt confrontation, while maintaining invisible influence. The do-nothing kings may have exercised a degree of control and continuity that is underappreciated in conventional histories. Their passivity was, in some ways, a shield and a strategy, preserving both life and authority in a volatile political landscape. Religion remained central to their rule. By maintaining ties with the church and participating in sacred rituals, these kings reinforced the perception of legitimacy and divine favor. The church, in turn, relied on the dynasty's symbolic authority to stabilize society, creating a mutually reinforcing system of power. Even in periods of apparent inactivity, the Merovingians continued to shape the moral, cultural, and spiritual framework of the kingdom, ensuring that their influence extended far beyond direct political action. The mayors of the palace, often seen as the true power behind the throne during this period, were not entirely independent actors. They operated within a framework defined by Merovingian sacred authority and symbolic legitimacy. The king's ceremonial presence, combined with their ritual observances, long hair, and ancestral claims, continued to anchor loyalty, ensuring that the dynasty remained central to governance even when practical administration was delegated. In this sense, the do-nothing kings may have been quietly orchestrating a form of power that was invisible yet profoundly effective. Archaeological evidence and surviving artifacts hint at continuity during these seemingly passive reigns. Coins, ceremonial objects, and burial practices maintain the symbols of Merovingian authority. Even when kings were inactive in recorded history, these objects and rituals ensured that sacred kingship persisted, reinforcing legitimacy in subtle but enduring ways. The dynasty's presence was thus not merely a matter of historical record, but of perception, ritual, and inherited authority. The notion of passivity may also have served a defensive purpose. By appearing weak, these kings could avoid provoking rivals or inciting rebellion, creating a climate in which the dynasty's continuity was protected. Simultaneously, their symbolic authority and sacred rituals ensured that their rule remained unquestioned by those attuned to the traditions of Merovingian kingship. Power, in this period, was exercised in whispers, in gestures, and through networks that were invisible to chroniclers, but unmistakable to those within the dynasty's sphere of influence. Legends surrounding the Merovingians during this period reinforce the idea that the dynasty's power was both sacred and enduring. Tales of kings who were passive yet invincible, who ruled without apparent effort, and whose influence persisted despite visible inactivity reflect a cultural memory of authority that transcends ordinary politics. These stories suggest a dynasty that understood the interplay between perception and reality, and that wielded power through subtle, often invisible means. In many ways, the era of the do-nothing kings demonstrates the sophistication of Merovingian rule. Authority was not always measured by immediate action or conquest, but by the endurance of influence, the maintenance of sacred legitimacy, and the careful orchestration of loyalty. These kings, though seemingly passive, were guardians of a hidden system of power, one that blended ritual, symbolism, diplomacy, and strategic delegation into a form of governance that was both resilient and enduring. As we examine this period, it becomes clear that the Merovingians were masters of subtlety. They ruled not only through armies and edicts, but through networks, ritual, and perception. The do-nothing kings were not failures. They were stewards of continuity, maintaining the sacred and political authority of the dynasty even in an era of apparent decline. Their reigns remind us that true power can be invisible, quiet, and patient, flowing through hidden channels, preserved in symbols, and sustained by the subtle orchestration of human behavior and belief. The legacy of this era is profound. It challenges conventional interpretations of power and governance, suggesting that authority can exist without overt action, that influence can be exercised quietly, and that a dynasty's strength may reside as much in perception and ritual as in conquest or law. The Merovingians, even in apparent inactivity, maintained a web of sacred and political power, leaving a foundation upon which later kings, myth, and mystery would build. Their story invites us to look beyond the surface of history, to consider the hidden currents of influence, and to recognize that the most enduring power is often invisible, patient, and deeply strategic. The idea of sacred kingship in early Europe is difficult for the modern mind to fully grasp. We live in a world where leadership is transactional, bureaucratic, and often mechanical. But in the deep past, long before the rise of centralized monarchies and papal authority, kingship carried an entirely different weight. A king was not merely a ruler. He was a bridge between the earthly and the divine. His presence was believed to maintain the balance of nature, the fertility of the land, and even the spiritual harmony of his people. To understand the Merovingians properly, one must step into that older worldview, where symbolism mattered as much as genealogy, and where myth shaped the fabric of political reality. In this older framework, the Merovingians were seen not just as leaders, but as custodians of ancient knowledge. Their lineage, real or mythologized, connected them to a sacred past stretching beyond Rome, beyond the Gauls, perhaps even beyond written memory. Their long hair, often mocked by later chroniclers, was not simply a cultural quirk. It was an emblem of their spiritual authority, a visible sign that they were set apart from ordinary men. In Merovingian tradition, cutting a king's hair was not a hairstyle change. It was an act of political annihilation. A shaved Merovingian was no longer considered divinely legitimate. He became just another nobleman. This belief alone hints that their authority rested on something older than Christian coronation rites. It was a vestige of a pre-Roman, possibly even pre-Celtic system of sacral kingship. Such systems once existed across many Indo-European societies. Among the Celts, kings were believed to embody the land itself. Their vitality was the vitality of the kingdom. In some traditions, the king underwent ritual marriages with the goddess of sovereignty, a symbolic union ensuring the prosperity of the realm. In others, the king's failure, or even his physical infirmity, could be interpreted as a sign that the land would fail as well. Echoes of this belief survived faintly in medieval tales where kings suffer illnesses that mirror the decay of their kingdoms, and where only the Grail's mysteries can restore both the ruler and the land. It is within this symbolic landscape that the Merovingians gain their mysterious aura. Their stories seem to dwell halfway between history and myth. Legends of Meroveca's sea-born father, the Quinator, feel less like political invention and more like fragments of an older cosmology where rulers claimed descent from supernatural beings. Similar traditions existed in Ireland, Scandinavia, and even ancient Greece. A divine or semi-divine origin was not merely a boast. It was a way of saying that the king's authority came from a realm beyond human tampering. This possibility becomes more intriguing when we examine how the Church initially struggled to integrate Merovingian kingship into its doctrinal framework. Unlike later medieval monarchs, who derived legitimacy through papal blessing, early Merovingians stood upon traditions the Church did not fully control. Their authority came from tribal memory, ritual significance, and a reputation for carrying a kind of inherited spiritual force. Some scholars have suggested that the Church tolerated Merovingian power but never entirely trusted it. Their sacral status, so deeply rooted in pre-Christian symbolism, may have seemed too close to paganism. Their rituals, many now lost, may have encoded meanings that were incompatible with the emerging Christian worldview. For supporters of esoteric history, this is precisely where the Merovingian fascination intensifies. The suggestion is not that the Merovingians practiced secret magic or guarded occult rituals, but rather that they represented a surviving strand of an older, more mystical Europe. A Europe in which spiritual authority and earthly rule were intertwined. A Europe whose deeper structures were being overwritten by new religious and political powers. This tension becomes especially vivid when the Merovingian kings are linked, rightly or wrongly, to the broader tapestry of European esotericism. The theory is not that they held the Holy Grail or secret relics, but that their mode of kingship itself resembles elements preserved in later Grail literature. In the Grail romances, we encounter a mysterious lineage, a wounded king whose condition affects the land, and a set of secrets maintained by a select few. While these stories were written centuries after the Merovingians, some researchers believe they encode much older ideas about royal authority, ideas that mirror the Merovingian worldview more closely than the Carolingian or medieval model of kingship. Whether or not the Merovingians actually held esoteric knowledge, their reputation suggests that contemporaries believed they possessed something unusual. Even opponents seem to sense their symbolic weight. When the Carolingians replaced them, they did more than seize power. They reshaped the narrative of kingship itself. Charlemagne's coronation marked the triumph of a new political order, one grounded in papal authority and Roman-style legitimacy, rather than mystical inheritance. The older model of sacred kingship, embodied by the Merovingians, faded into the background. What remained were fragments, legends, rumors, and the lingering sense that something ancient had been interrupted. Over time, these fragments became seeds for myth-making. Medieval chroniclers whispered about hidden heirs. Local traditions preserved the memory of long-haired kings who walked the boundary between history and dream. Modern writers, fascinated by hidden threads of European identity, transformed these whispers into full-blown theories about bloodlines, secret societies, and esoteric survival. While much of this belongs to the realm of speculation, it reflects something deeper, the human instinct to sense meaning in what feels half-buried, half-remembered. Ultimately, the Merovingians endure not because of their political accomplishments, but because of the symbolic power they carried. They represent a Europe where kingship was not merely administration, but metaphysics, where rulers were guardians of mystery, bridges between the visible and the invisible. Whether or not they actually possessed sacred knowledge, they embodied a worldview in which such knowledge mattered. In the silence of their forgotten tombs, in the echo of their long-vanished rituals, and in the stories that refuse to die, the Merovingians continue to whisper of a time when power was not just inherited, but consecrated. For centuries, stories of sacred relics have drifted through European history like half-remembered dreams, objects said to carry divine power, lost knowledge, or the echoes of forgotten dynasties. Among these relics, none have captured the imagination more deeply than the Holy Grail and the Spear of Longinus. Yet in the shadows of medieval legend, another thread quietly weaves itself into the narrative, the mysterious presence of the Merovingians. Though rarely named directly in the great romances, their fingerprints appear subtly upon the imagery, symbols, and archetypes that saturate these tales. It is as though the stories of sacred relics and the silent legacy of the long-haired kings were once part of a shared memory, later split apart and disguised in allegory. When we enter the world of the Grail romances, we step into a realm where kings are wounded, destinies are entangled with objects beyond this world, and knowledge is hidden behind veils of metaphor. The earliest Grail stories, attributed to Chrétien de Troyes and later expanded by Wolfram von Eschenbach, depict a mysterious lineage entrusted with guarding the sacred vessel. This lineage is neither fully Christian nor fully pagan. It is something in between, a bridge between an older world and the rising medieval order. This liminal quality is precisely what makes researchers draw parallels to Merovingian kingship, which itself existed on the threshold between pagan ancestry and Christian rule. In many versions of the Grail tale, The Grail is not a cup, but a stone, a plate, or a vessel capable of sustaining life, an object that confers kingship or healing upon the rightful bearer. This idea resonates with the aura surrounding the Merovingians, whose legitimacy was said to derive from something deep-rooted and mystical, something that could not be transferred or forged. The Grail's guardianship by an appointed family mirrors the Merovingian model. Kingship as inheritance of sacred duty, not merely political authority. There is also the archetype of the wounded fisher king, a figure whose suffering is mysteriously linked to the health of the land. This idea aligns strongly with ancient European notions of sacred kingship, where the ruler's vitality directly influenced the prosperity of the kingdom. While the Merovingians are never explicitly tied to the fisher king, the symbolic parallels are difficult to ignore. Their long hair, their divine ancestry, their perceived role as spiritual guardians. These elements echo quietly within the structure of the Grail myths. The spear of Longinus adds another layer to this tapestry. According to Christian legend, it was the spear that pierced the side of Christ during the crucifixion, an object infused with divine power and destiny. Medieval rulers believed that possession of the spear granted victory, sovereignty, and protection from divine judgment. Yet, long before the Holy Roman emperors claimed it, relics resembling the sacred spear appeared in Merovingian inventories and treasure lists. Some chroniclers describe royal spears carried by early Frankish kings as symbols of judgment and divine authority, relics older than their Christian associations. While it is unlikely that the Merovingians possessed the true spear of Longinus, the overlap in symbolic meaning is striking. Both objects represented legitimacy bestowed by a higher power. Both were believed to ensure victory in battle, and both acted as visible manifestations of invisible authority. In some accounts, Merovingian kings were known to bless or curse with their spear, gestures that appear ritualistic rather than merely martial. The blending of sacred and royal power sits at the core of their mystique. Then there is the curious phenomenon of vessel relics in Frankish tradition, objects described in early sources as containers of sacred oils, ancestral relics, or objects used in initiation rites. Some of these vessels were said to be kept hidden and brought out only during coronation ceremonies. Their descriptions are vague, sometimes intentionally so, as if chroniclers were describing something they did not fully understand or were not permitted to explain. Over time, these relic descriptions became entangled with Grail-related speculation. Could the Grail stories be allegories inspired by real, but now forgotten Merovingian ritual objects? We cannot know for certain, but the possibility is intriguing enough to linger in historical imagination. Geography also binds the Merovingians to Grail lore in subtle ways. Many Grail stories are set in regions once ruled by the Merovingians or deeply influenced by Frankish culture. The forests of the Ardennes, the river valleys of the Loire, and the Pyrenean foothills. These landscapes hold layers of history, Roman remnants, Celtic myth, early Christian shrines, and the silent footprints of Merovingian kings. In some areas, local legends blend saints with older pagan figures, sometimes describing kings who healed by touch or communicated with spirits of the land. Such traditions echo the spiritual authority attributed to early Merovingian rulers, making the boundary between history and myth feel thinner than ever. Rennes-le-Château, perhaps the most famous mystery site in France, sits not far from ancient Merovingian strongholds. Though its modern legends erupted in the 19th century, the region's deeper history is saturated with Visigothic and Frankish influence. Some researchers argue that certain symbols found in the area, crosses, serpents, interwoven crowns, may reflect traditions linked to early Frankish sacral kingship. Whether intentional or coincidental, these connections amplify the sense that the Merovingians were part of a larger symbolic network, a web of relics, myths, and sacred geography. The Grail legends also preserve themes of hidden knowledge, knowledge that can only be accessed by those of the right lineage or spiritual purity. This theme resonates strongly with the Merovingian mystique, which was often portrayed as esoteric and hereditary. Their divine ancestry myth, their prohibition against cutting royal hair, and their rumored possession of ritual relics all hint at a worldview in which power is not merely inherited but spiritually transmitted. At the core of these parallels lies a profound question. Were the Merovingians simply historical rulers later absorbed into myth-making? Or were the Grail stories themselves built upon older traditions that the Merovingians once embodied? Most scholars lean toward the first explanation, seeing the Merovingians as an intriguing but ultimately ordinary dynasty. Yet, the persistence of their mythic qualities and their reappearance in speculative literature suggests that something deeper may be at work. They were a dynasty standing at the crossroads between the ancient and medieval worlds, guardians of a symbolic inheritance that predated the Church's formalized rituals. Their association with relics, both real and imagined, may be less about literal possession and more about the echoes of a worldview in which kingship was sacred in itself. In many ways, the Grail legends function like a mirror, reflecting fragments of forgotten European beliefs. And when we look into that mirror, the silhouette of the Merovingian dynasty occasionally appears, not as explicit characters, but as an underlying presence, a lineage whose memory seeped into myth even after history tried to erase them. Perhaps the Grail is not a single object, but a symbol of kingship itself, lost, guarded, or misunderstood. Perhaps the spear represents the divine sanction of rule, a blessing that passes not through papal decree, but through ancient tradition. And perhaps the Merovingians, with their silent rituals and mysterious ancestry, were the last dynasty to embody that older form of sacred authority. In the end, whether these connections are literal truth or symbolic resonance, they reveal a compelling possibility that beneath the medieval stories of knights and relics lies an older current of European spirituality, one that the Merovingians once carried and which later generations remembered only in legend. There is a place in southern France where history, rumor, and imagination seem to intertwine so tightly that separating truth from myth becomes almost impossible. Perched on a hill overlooking the Aude Valley, the small village of Rennes-le-Château has become one of Europe's most enigmatic locations. Though it looks quiet and unremarkable at first glance, it carries a reputation that stretches far beyond its modest size. To some, it is merely a charming rural commune. To others, it is a map point aligned with ancient power lines, a resting place for forgotten royalty, a hiding spot for relics beyond comprehension, or a key to the lingering riddle of the Merovingians. The modern mystery of Rennes-le-Château began in the late 19th century with the strange behavior of its parish priest, Berenger Saunière, who abruptly acquired wealth far beyond his clerical salary. He renovated the church, constructed ornate structures, bought luxurious items, and traveled extensively without any clear explanation for the source of his funds. His sudden prosperity inevitably sparked rumors: treasure, secret patrons, blackmail, forbidden knowledge, coded parchments, and hidden vaults beneath the church. Over time, these rumors expanded, absorbed older legends, and transformed into a mythology of their own. But behind the modern drama lies a much older context, one that stretches back into the early medieval world and connects this obscure region to the long-faded Merovingian dynasty. The lands around Rennes-le-Château were once part of the Visigothic kingdom, a powerful realm that controlled much of southern France after the fall of Rome. The Visigoths were known custodians of precious relics, including, according to some traditions, sacred objects brought from Jerusalem during the collapse of the temple. Whether this tradition is historical or not remains debated, but it creates a symbolic foundation. This region was once a refuge for displaced kings, wandering relics, and hidden treasures. To imagine that something ancient might be buried within its hills is not entirely unreasonable. But the deeper connection emerges when we consider how the Merovingians interacted with this landscape. Early Frankish chronicles describe campaigns, alliances, and settlements that brought Merovingian influence into the very regions surrounding Rennes-le-Château. Old place names, burial mounds, and archaeological fragments hint at early Frankish presence here. Some historians believe that Merovingian aristocrats may have owned land in the area long before written records became consistent. Others note that early church constructions in the region exhibit architectural features linked to Frankish patronage. Whether or not they lived here directly, the symbolism of geography creates a compelling narrative, a frontier region where competing traditions met: Roman, Visigothic, Frankish, Celtic, and early Christian. In such a place, stories naturally accumulate, and stories, over centuries, transform into myth. The hilltop village itself carries strange architectural clues. Saunière's church, dedicated to Mary Magdalene, already triggers curiosity. The Magdalene cult was historically strong in southern France, entwined with local legends that she fled to this region after the events in Jerusalem. For some, this tradition overlaps with alternative histories linking her to royal bloodlines and sacred descendants. Even if these ideas remain speculative, the dedication of the church creates a symbolic anchor, a location tied to feminine sanctity, secrecy, and the idea of hidden legacy. Inside the church, Saunière installed puzzling inscriptions, unusual statuary, and symbols that seem deliberately chosen to provoke interpretation. A demon supporting the weight of holy water. Stations of the cross with unconventional imagery. Strange Latin phrases that have been translated in multiple ways. A mosaic floor depicting celestial alignments. All of it feels like a coded message, though no consensus exists on what the message might be. Some researchers argue that Saunière merely decorated his church in a flamboyant style fashionable among certain 19th century clergy. Others insist that he uncovered something, documents, relics, or genealogical secrets, that thrust him into a network with knowledge of immense historical consequence. In the space between these explanations, legend grows. From here, the narrative connects ever more deeply to the Merovingians. Many theories claim that the priest discovered evidence of a surviving Merovingian bloodline preserved in local genealogies or hidden in the church's archives. Some point to Saunière's sudden habit of traveling to Paris, where he visited libraries and met with influential figures. They ask why a simple village priest needed access to rare historical manuscripts, or why he frequented artistic and literary circles that were obsessed with Grail lore and ancient dynasties. Others draw attention to the region's landscape itself. Across southern France, particularly in the Rennes-le-Château area, researchers have identified geometric patterns, triangles, pentagrams, star shapes, formed by churches, peaks, and ancient ruins. Are these intentional alignments or coincidences imposed by imaginative minds? The answer remains unclear, but the patterns, real or perceived, hint at a form of sacred geography. In ancient cultures, landscapes were often aligned deliberately for ritual or symbolic reasons. Certain locations were chosen because they resonated with mythic associations. If the Merovingians operated within a worldview influenced by sacred kingship and ritual geography, it is not impossible that relics or sanctuaries associated with them might be placed along such alignments. There is also the old rumor that the Visigoths brought a lost treasure to this region before their collapse, possibly a collection of ancient artifacts, ritual objects, or royal archives. This treasure, if it existed, may have been hidden in a fortified site, monastery, or crypt. The Merovingians, who interacted with Visigothic nobility, both through conflict and marriage alliances, might have inherited or become entangled in these hidden legacies. Over centuries, the memory of such connections could fade, leaving behind only fragmentary folklore, whispers of wealth, lost vaults, and sacred knowledge buried beneath the hills. One of the most persistent ideas is that Rennes-le-Château represents a node in a larger network of Merovingian-related sites scattered across France and encoded through symbols that defy easy interpretation. These sites include places associated with early Frankish kings, saintly cults, and enigmatic medieval constructions that seem excessively elaborate for their modest purposes. The suggestion is not that these locations conceal physical treasures, but that they form a map, a symbolic landscape illustrating an older worldview now obscured by centuries of political and religious change. Yet, even without relying on the more speculative theories, the region undeniably resonates with forgotten history. Ancient graves, toppled dolmens, ruined chapels, and Celtic artifacts beneath vineyards create a palimpsest of narratives. Every layer of settlement added a new myth or belief. Over time, these layers merged, producing a place where history feels almost alive, restless, shifting, whispering. Rennes-le-Château, then, becomes more than a mystery village. It becomes a lens through which we view the tension between historical fact and symbolic truth. Whether or not Saunière uncovered anything of genuine significance, the atmosphere of the place evokes a deep sense of hidden continuity between the sacred kingship of the Merovingians, the enigmatic legends of the Visigoths, the spiritual traditions of early Christianity, and the lingering pre-Christian memory embedded in the land. For those fascinated by alternative history, the village functions like a riddle box. Each answer leads to another question. For skeptics, it remains a picturesque site whose reputation was shaped by coincidence and clever storytelling. But in either case, the allure persists. Something about the place feels unfinished, unresolved, as if waiting for the right person to decipher its silent patterns. The connection to the Merovingians may not be literal, but symbolic. The region embodies themes central to their legacy: hidden lineage, sacred landscapes, forgotten rituals, and the quiet persistence of memory despite official erasure. It stands as a reminder that history is not merely a record of events. It is a living tapestry woven from myth, interpretation, silence, and imagination. And sometimes the land remembers even when the chronicles do not. In the landscape of European esoteric history, few names have sparked as much fascination, debate, and confusion as the Priory of Chaon. It exists in a strange twilight zone, half-documented, half-invented, yet entirely captivating. Some see it as a deliberate hoax crafted in the 20th century. Others believe it preserves fragments of an older, hidden tradition that predates its modern exposure by centuries. And at the center of this tangled web lies the recurring suggestion that the priory somehow connects to the Merovingians, not necessarily through direct guardianship, but through a shared symbolic lineage, one tied to sacred kingship, guardianship of knowledge, and the preservation of alternative histories. To understand this mystery, one must separate the layers: fact, fabrication, and the deeper truths that lie underneath both. The contemporary fame of the Priory of Chaon began in the 1950s and 1960s when enigmatic documents surfaced in French national archives. These documents, known as the dossiers secrets, contain genealogies, coded notes, and references to a secret society allegedly founded in 1099 during the First Crusade. The papers claimed that the priory's mission was to protect the descendants of the Merovingian dynasty and restore them to their rightful place in European history. Names of supposed Grand Masters were listed. Figures such as Leonardo da Vinci, Nicolas Flamel, Victor Hugo, and Jean Cocteau. It was a sensational claim, one that blurred the boundary between legitimate scholarship and imaginative myth-making. Eventually, researchers discovered that these documents were forgeries planted by Pierre Plantard, a Frenchman who wove elaborate stories about secret bloodlines and ancient societies. According to official records, Plantard invented the Priory of Chaon as part of a personal fantasy about royal descent. Yet the controversy did not end there, because something about the story, fictional or not, resonated deeply with older traditions and unanswered historical questions. The myth refused to die. The dilemma is this. Even if the modern priory is a fabrication, it draws upon ideas that are much older than Plantard. Ideas about hidden guardians, sacred bloodlines, and secret custodians of European identity have circulated for centuries. Medieval Europe was full of confraternities, monastic orders, knightly organizations, and mystical societies whose records are incomplete or lost. Many of these groups were responsible for preserving relics, texts, or traditions that did not align neatly with official church doctrine. To imagine that at least one such group might have carried fragments of Merovingian lore forward through time is not entirely implausible. This is where the priory's mythology becomes more nuanced. It is not the modern organization that captivates historians and theorists. It is the possibility that behind the myth lies a real but forgotten tradition. Not a single secret society, perhaps, but a series of groups, families, or monastic networks who guarded ancient narratives that contradicted the dominant medieval story of kingship. For example, throughout the Middle Ages, whispers persisted about royal bloodlines that survived political purges. Monasteries often kept detailed genealogies, some of which included names of minor noble families believed to have Merovingian ancestry. These genealogies rarely made it into official chronicles, but circulated privately among families and clerical elites. The Church's role in legitimizing the Carolingian and subsequent dynasties may have created a subtle pressure to keep alternative claims quiet. After all, if a rival bloodline could claim divine right older than the Carolingians, the entire system of medieval legitimacy would have been destabilized. Some scholars suggest that Plantard's hoax succeeded because it tapped into this subconscious historical memory, because it resurrected a forgotten tension in European identity. The Merovingians represented a vision of kingship that predated the centralized church and the later concept of divine right sanctioned by Rome. Their legitimacy came from tradition, ancestry, and spiritual symbolism rather than religious approval. This distinction, subtle as it may seem today, mattered immensely in medieval politics. Even if there was never a group formally called the Priory of Chaon before Plantard, there were certainly groups with similar roles: guardians of sacred relics, custodians of regional histories, preservers of pre-Catholic traditions. Some were absorbed into larger monastic orders. Others simply vanished without record. The idea of a guardianship order is therefore not as far-fetched as it initially appears. The only questionable part is whether such a group explicitly protected the Merovingian bloodline. Yet, this possibility cannot be dismissed entirely. Monastic chronicles occasionally reference noble families who claimed Merovingian descent. Some of these families held unusual privileges or ancient lands that seemed disproportionately significant given their political obscurity. In certain regions of France, particularly in the south, legends persisted of forgotten princes, exiled heirs, or children spirited away to monasteries for protection. These stories existed long before Plantard. They existed long before anyone connected them to a priory. In this way, the modern priory myth functions like a key inserted into an old lock. Not because the key is authentic, but because the lock itself was already there. Another interesting layer arises when examining the symbolism associated with the priory: the use of stars, roses, fleurs de lis, and geometrical crossings. These symbols appear in ancient Merovingian art, medieval heraldry, Templar regalia, and esoteric manuscripts. Symbolism can be misleading, but can also be revealing. Some symbols survive long after their original meaning is forgotten, preserved in coats of arms, church carvings, or local traditions. If a medieval confraternity did preserve Merovingian traditions, they might have used recognizable symbols as markers, passing them down through generations even when the larger context was lost. It is also notable that many places associated with the priory myth overlap with regions historically connected to the early Franks or with sites linked to sacred relics. For example, parts of Burgundy, Languedoc, and the Loire Valley contain both Merovingian archaeological remains and later legends involving hidden guardianship. Whether this overlap is meaningful or coincidental remains open to interpretation. The priory story also intersects with broader questions about how history is written. Who decides which records survive? Who has the authority to declare a dynasty legitimate? The Carolingians, and later the Capetians, depended on the narrative of Merovingian weakness to justify their takeover. Chroniclers loyal to these dynasties often portrayed the Merovingians as decadent or ineffective, subtly diminishing their legacy. If any group, formal or informal, attempted to preserve an alternative view of Merovingian history, their efforts might have been overshadowed or erased by political necessity. From a more symbolic perspective, the priory myth represents a longing for continuity, a belief that the deeper, more mystical Europe did not simply vanish but continued quietly beneath the surface. It reflects a yearning for a time when leadership was tied to sacred principles rather than bureaucracy, and when the spiritual and political realms were inseparable. Perhaps this is why the priory resonates even after being debunked. People sense that the myth touches something ancient, something unresolved. It points to an absence in the official record, a blank space where a different story might once have been. The priory myth may not be true in a literal sense, but it illuminates the shadows of history, drawing attention to the parts deliberately obscured or accidentally forgotten. Ultimately, whether the priory of Chaon is fact, fiction, or a mixture of both, its connection to the Merovingian mystery lies not in physical documents or proven lineages, but in the deeper psychological and symbolic landscape of Europe. It speaks to the enduring idea that some knowledge is too important to disappear completely, that some stories survive even when buried, and that the past has guardians, whether human or mythical, who refuse to let it fade. In the end, the priory becomes less a literal secret society and more a metaphor for the hidden layers of history itself. It embodies the idea that behind every official narrative lies another, quieter one that whispers of forgotten kings, unbroken bloodlines, and mysteries that refuse to be silenced. Among the most enigmatic concepts associated with the legacy of the early Frankish rulers is the idea of bloodline symbolism, an idea that emerges not only from historical documentation, but from folklore, mythology, sacred art, and the traditions of medieval Europe. The Merovingians, in particular, have long been surrounded by an aura that blurs the boundaries between recorded history and spiritual mythology. While their political achievements are well documented, it is the deeper cultural and symbolic heritage attached to them that has given rise to centuries of speculation. Their dynasty has been the focus of legends involving divine ancestry, mystical abilities, and ancient rituals, and although modern historians often dismiss these ideas as myth-making, they represent an important piece of Europe's hidden cultural memory. The foundation of this mystique lies in the portrayal of the Merovingian kings not merely as rulers, but as sacred figures whose authority was believed to be rooted in something beyond ordinary lineage. According to several medieval sources, the kings were distinguished by a unique physical trait: long, uncut hair, which symbolized divine favor and spiritual power. This hair was not aesthetic, but ritualistic. It operated as a marker of legitimacy. Many contemporaries believed that cutting a Merovingian king's hair would strip him of authority. The very idea that physical attributes could be tied to political destiny reflects an older worldview where kingship was inseparable from sacred symbolism. Beyond the hair, other legends suggested that the Merovingians descended from a semi-divine ancestor, sometimes described as a sea creature, a mythical beast, or a symbolic hybrid representing otherworldly influence. This mythic origin was not unusual in early medieval Europe, where many royal houses claimed descent from gods or supernatural beings. Yet, in the case of the Merovingians, such legends persisted long after the dynasty fell, hinting at a deeper cultural resonance. These stories were not simply political propaganda. They were part of a larger symbolic system linking kingship to the natural and spiritual worlds. Over time, these myths merged with Christian and pre-Christian motifs, creating a tapestry of imagery that evolved through centuries. Medieval chroniclers, especially those writing under later dynasties, sometimes dismissed or downplayed these legends, viewing them as pagan remnants. However, the persistence of these stories in local folklore suggests that they carried meanings that transcended religion or politics. They spoke to an ancient belief that leadership must be connected to the sacred, that lineage must reflect not just inheritance, but a cosmic order. Symbols associated with the Merovingians further reinforced this perception. The bee, for instance, has long been associated with their dynasty, appearing in royal treasures and burial artifacts. Bees were viewed as messengers between worlds, bridging the realms of the living and the divine. They symbolized immortality, resurrection, and noble purity. Centuries later, Napoleon attempted to revive the bee as a royal symbol, possibly as an intentional reference to Merovingian heritage. Whether or not he understood the deeper mythology, the connection reveals how symbols can survive and re-emerge across eras, carrying their hidden meanings with them. Another recurring symbol is the fleur-de-lis, which became synonymous with French royalty in later centuries. Some researchers believe that its origins may predate the Capetians and may have roots in Merovingian symbolism. Although this cannot be conclusively proven, the motif appears in early Frankish art, burial designs, and ornamental metalwork. The flower represents purity, rebirth, and sacred authority, aligning with the spiritual imagery surrounding the dynasty. Even if the fleur-de-lis evolved through various cultural contexts, its symbolic resonance reflects the same ancient worldview that shaped Merovingian identity. The connection between the Merovingians and sacred geography also forms an essential aspect of this symbolic landscape. Their rise occurred in regions rich with pre-Christian cultural significance, lands dotted with ancient burial sites, standing stones, and sacred groves. Many early churches built under Merovingian patronage were intentionally placed on older pagan sites, suggesting a continuity of sacred guardianship rather than a complete cultural break. Even after Christianization, the sense of the king as a mediator between worlds remained, blending old and new traditions into a unique spiritual lineage. Throughout the Middle Ages, fragments of this symbolic heritage survived in unexpected places. Certain monastic communities preserved stories about early kings that emphasized their spiritual qualities rather than their political achievements. Local legends spoke of kings with prophetic dreams, miraculous healings, or supernatural encounters. These stories may not be historically verifiable, but they reveal what the people of the time believed about their leaders, that the king's legitimacy derived from something deeper than blood alone, something bound to the divine. This reverence persisted even after the Merovingian dynasty ended. Their successors, the Carolingians and later the Capetians, attempted to erase or diminish their memory, portraying them as weak or incompetent. Yet, the older traditions survived quietly in folklore, underground manuscripts, and regional customs. In some areas, particularly in the south of France, families continued to claim distant descent from Merovingian lines, not for political ambition, but as a sign of spiritual distinction. Such claims were often accompanied by symbols, coats of arms, ancestral stories, or ritual objects that carried echoes of the old myths. The endurance of these symbols suggests that they touched something fundamental within European culture. They represented a worldview where lineage was intertwined with destiny, where rulers were not simply political figures, but custodians of sacred heritage. The Merovingians, whether intentionally or through later myth-making, came to embody the idea of a forgotten or suppressed legacy, one that held alternative visions of kingship, spirituality, and power. In the modern era, this symbolic legacy resurfaced in unexpected ways. Esoteric and mystical authors in the 19th and 20th centuries began re-examining medieval sources, interpreting Merovingian legends through the lens of hidden traditions. They saw the dynasty not only as historical rulers, but as symbols of an alternative European identity, one rooted in mystery, continuity, and ancient wisdom. This perspective influenced later movements and fictional works that portrayed the dynasty as guardians of secret knowledge or bearers of a sacred lineage. These interpretations may not be historically accurate, but they highlight how deeply the symbolic legacy of the Merovingians had penetrated the cultural imagination. Even scholars who reject the more fantastical interpretations acknowledge that the Merovingians occupy a unique place in European historical consciousness. They represent a transitional era between antiquity and the medieval world, a time when cultures were merging, religions were transforming, and political structures were being redefined. The symbolic layer surrounding their dynasty reflects this complexity. It is a mixture of pagan beliefs, early Christian ideas, regional folklore, and the cultural memory of a people navigating profound change. In this sense, the legends do not distort history, they enrich it. The fascination with Merovingian symbolism also raises deeper questions about how societies understand power. Why do certain dynasties inspire myths of sacred descent while others fade into the background? Why do some symbols persist across centuries while others vanish? These questions point to a truth often overlooked, that history is not merely a record of events, but a tapestry woven from human belief, imagination, and identity. The Merovingians occupy a place in this tapestry not because of political dominance alone, but because they became vessels for a much older and larger story. Ultimately, the symbolic legacy of the Merovingians endures because it speaks to something timeless. The idea that leadership is more than governance, that lineage carries stories deeper than blood, and that some dynasties, whether or not they recognized it themselves, become mythic mirrors for the civilizations they once shaped. As the centuries moved beyond the Merovingian age and Europe reshaped itself through empires, renaissances, and revolutions, one question continued to ripple beneath the surface of historical inquiry. What became of the Merovingian lineage? The dynasty that had once ruled vast stretches of Western Europe seemed to vanish abruptly from political prominence. Their long-haired kings disappeared from chronicles, their sacral authority extinguished, their rituals abandoned, their symbols repurposed or overwritten. Yet something in their legacy refused to fade completely. Fragmentary genealogies, obscure documents, whispered family traditions, and reinterpretations by later scholars all sustain the possibility that the lineage had not perished, but had simply slipped out of the spotlight. In the centuries following their political downfall, Europe became a patchwork of rising dynasties, each eager to establish legitimacy. The Carolingians, who replaced the Merovingians, took great care to portray themselves as the rightful heirs of the Frankish realm. This required not only political maneuvering, but narrative control. The Merovingians were recast as shadow kings, rulers in name only, unfit to lead. The monastic chroniclers who recorded the transition often followed Carolingian interests, downplaying the importance of the earlier dynasty. Yet, even within those accounts, faint hints lingered. References to sideline princes, surviving cadet branches, and families whose bloodline continued through marriage. Such mentions were typically small, passing, and ordinary. But in the context of a dynasty surrounded by mythic aura, even small details became fertile ground for speculation. The idea that Merovingian descendants continued to live quietly among the nobility was not impossible. In fact, it was historically likely. When dynasties fall, their members often disperse into the wider aristocracy, retaining status but losing central authority. Many medieval families claimed descent from earlier royal houses, and the Merovingians were no exception. Some documents from the early medieval period mention families connected to Merovingian princes who had not taken the throne. These descendants, lacking political influence, integrated into regional nobility. Over generations, their lineages intertwined with new ruling families in Burgundy, Aquitaine, Provence, and Rhine territories. While many of these genealogies are tangled, fragmentary, or contradictory, they share a common theme. The Merovingian line may have survived, but not in a form that threatened the newly established Carolingian order. By the time the Capetians rose to power, the Merovingians existed more as a distant historical memory than a political reality. Yet the idea of an ancient and sacred bloodline continued to hold symbolic weight. Medieval Europe placed enormous cultural importance on heritage and ancestry. A family that could trace its roots to an earlier sacred dynasty gained automatic prestige. Thus, it is unsurprising that various noble houses in France, Germany, and even parts of northern Italy claimed some measure of Merovingian descent, not as a political challenge to the ruling monarchy, but as a badge of ancient dignity. These claims were generally accepted without controversy. No one interpreted them as a threat. Europe had moved on. The age of sacred kingship had given way to feudalization, the strengthening of the church, and new models of legitimacy. And yet, in the shadows of these genealogies, certain patterns emerged. Some families preserved unusual symbols reminiscent of early Frankish iconography. The bee, the crescent, the stylized lily. Some retained oral traditions about royal ancestors whose significance exceeded the usual noble boasting. In a few rare cases, mysterious manuscripts referencing the old kings appeared in monastic archives without explanation. Most historians treated these as artifacts of medieval imagination rather than literal survival. But even skepticism could not entirely erase the sense of an unresolved story. The narrative took an unexpected turn centuries later during the medieval flowering of Grail literature. Although written long after the Merovingians had vanished from political relevance, these stories featured themes that echoed older ideas of sacred kingship. The wounded ruler whose health influenced the land, the bloodline that carried spiritual authority, the guardianship of a mysterious relic passed down through generations. The parallels between Grail mythology and the symbolic identity of the Merovingians were striking enough that later scholars, especially in the 19th and 20th centuries, began wondering whether the romances were preserving echoes of an earlier vision of kingship. Not all agreed, of course. Many dismissed the connections as poetic coincidence. Yet the idea took root among esoteric thinkers who suggested that certain medieval families might have preserved both the bloodline and the spiritual traditions associated with it. Whether this was true mattered less than the fact that it resonated deeply with the European imagination. A lost or hidden lineage evokes a sense of mystery, an unresolved question in the grand narrative of Western history. By the 1800s, Europe experienced a renewed fascination with medieval heritage. Genealogists, antiquarians, and amateur historians worked tirelessly to trace the ancestry of noble families. Some encountered tantalizing hints linking certain lineages back to the early Frankish rulers. The evidence was often incomplete, speculative, or dependent on medieval notaries whose accuracy was questionable. Yet, for those drawn to historical mysteries, these fragments were enough to suggest the survival of a bloodline whose symbolic importance far outweighed its political relevance. Secret societies and fraternal orders of the 19th century embraced this idea eagerly. Some groups claimed guardianship over ancient lineages or purported to preserve traditions passed down from forgotten dynasties. While most of these claims cannot be verified, they contributed to a growing narrative that the lineage of the ancient kings had not been erased, but had quietly persisted in the background, awaiting recognition. During the 20th century, this theme gained dramatic new life when writers and researchers began exploring the possibility of a surviving Merovingian bloodline connected to the Grail legends. Although highly speculative, these interpretations captured the imagination of a generation. The Merovingians were cast not merely as historical figures, but as symbols of a suppressed or concealed truth, one that challenged conventional narratives of European history. The debate that followed was heated. Scholars rejected the idea as pseudo-history. Critics argued that conflating medieval fantasy with genealogy distorted both fields. Yet, intriguingly, the controversy only deepened public fascination. Hidden lineage theories appeal precisely because they exist on the threshold between what is known and what is possible. They thrive in the gaps left by incomplete archives, lost documents, and unexplained patterns. It is important to distinguish between the mythic lineage, charged with symbolic and esoteric meaning, and the historical lineage, which almost certainly continued through ordinary aristocratic families. The historical possibility is straightforward. Merovingian descendants survived but lost political prominence, blending into the fabric of medieval nobility. The mythic lineage, however, carries far deeper implications. It suggests that something of the old sacral vision of kingship survived as well, not in political institutions, but in cultural memory, folklore, and symbolism. Even today, families in parts of France, Switzerland, and Germany quietly claim Merovingian ancestry. Some preserve genealogical charts dating back to the early Middle Ages. Others maintain traditions that their ancestors served or descended from the long-haired kings. These claims are rarely publicized, partly out of modesty and partly because the modern world views such heritage as a curiosity rather than a political asset. Yet the persistence of these traditions is noteworthy. It suggests that the memory of the Merovingians has remained alive not in the halls of power, but in the undercurrents of cultural identity. The idea of a surviving lineage also resonates on a psychological level. It taps into a universal human desire for continuity, belonging, and connection to ancient origins. For many, the Merovingians represent a link to a time when leadership was infused with spirituality, when kingship carried a deeper meaning. The thought that such a lineage might still exist, even in ordinary families, stripped of power but not of heritage, adds a sense of mystery to the modern world. Whether or not any modern family can prove unbroken descent from the ancient kings is ultimately less important than what the myth expresses. It reflects the enduring allure of a forgotten era, a longing to reconnect with stories that shaped the foundations of Europe. The Merovingians, in this sense, never truly disappeared. They simply changed form, from rulers of a kingdom to rulers of the imagination, from historical actors to symbols of something timeless. Their lineage, real or symbolic, survives not in archives alone, but in ideas, legends, and the quiet persistence of memory. As the centuries unfolded, one of the most intriguing aspects of the Merovingian legacy emerged in whispers rather than proclamations, in margins rather than headlines. The possibility of hidden guardianship. Even though the dynasty fell from political authority, many believe that certain individuals, monastic communities, or secretive circles continued to safeguard something, whether knowledge, relics, genealogical memory, spiritual traditions, or symbolic truths linked to the early kings. This idea took shape slowly, evolving from medieval rumors into Renaissance speculation, then solidifying in modern imagination as a core element of alternative history narratives. The origins of this belief lie partly in the abruptness of the Merovingian fall. Their displacement by the Carolingians felt orchestrated, almost too neat. A dynasty once considered semi-sacred was removed with surprising ease, as if the transition were supported by forces determined to erase a particular worldview. Yet the very effort to delegitimize the Merovingians left traces of discomfort in the sources. Monastic chroniclers avoided writing openly about certain aspects of the old sacral kingship. Court historians minimized the mysterious significance attached to the long-haired lineage. Too many details were omitted, too many unusual customs left unexplained, as though something was being silenced deliberately. This silence opened the door to speculation. If the dynasty carried traditions or knowledge deemed dangerous, politically, spiritually, or ideologically, what happened to those elements after the rulers themselves were sidelined? Did they vanish entirely? Or did some group, perhaps those closest to the dynasty, preserve fragments that could not be allowed into the hands of rivals? The early medieval church, while powerful, did not have complete control over literacy or manuscript culture. Certain monasteries operated with unusual independence, especially those founded in the Merovingian period. These institutions frequently stood on lands historically linked to sacred groves, ancient burial grounds, or pre-Christian spiritual centers. Some scholars have noted that monasteries such as Luxeuil, St. Denis, and others maintained peculiar traditions, special liturgies, or relics whose origins remain murky. None of this proves guardianship, but it provides fertile ground for imagining a network of communities preserving remnants of forgotten religious practices or symbolic meanings. Yet the idea of hidden guardianship does not rest solely on monastic traditions. Medieval Europe was full of semi-secret brotherhoods, guilds, knightly orders, hermetic circles, and localized fraternities. Some operated with royal charters. Others functioned beneath the surface, using rituals and codes inherited from pre-Christian times. It is not difficult to envision how individuals loyal to the Merovingian house, perhaps former advisors or members of the lesser aristocracy, could have embedded parts of the tradition into these circles. After all, knowledge and heritage tend to migrate into the structures that can shelter them. One of the reasons this hypothesis remains compelling is the persistent presence of Merovingian symbols in unexpected places. Certain knightly orders favored motifs that scholars struggle to trace back to Orthodox Christian iconography, but which align more closely with early Frankish symbolism. The bee, for instance, reappears across the centuries in contexts too specific to be coincidence. Likewise, the crescent and the stylized lily re-emerge in heraldic designs from regions once under Merovingian influence. Symbolic survivals often indicate cultural continuity, suggesting that some memory persisted through carefully maintained channels. During the Crusades, another layer of mystery emerged. Several European knights from families claiming or rumored to have Merovingian connections formed small, cohesive groups within the larger military orders. These men shared similar heraldry, participated in esoteric liturgies, and possessed financial resources disproportionate to their official rank. It is impossible to determine whether this reflected genuine lineage consciousness, ancient alliances, or mere aristocratic eccentricity. Yet the phenomenon is noteworthy because it shows that certain traditions, whether inherited or reinvented, held enough weight to influence behavior during one of the most transformative periods in medieval history. The Templars, in particular, became entangled with post-Merovingian mythology. Although the historical Templars were committed to Orthodox Christianity, later interpretations cast them as guardians of forbidden knowledge. Some modern researchers suggested that the Templars stumbled upon or inherited traditions connected to earlier European kings. These claims are speculative, and mainstream historians reject them. Yet one cannot deny that the destruction of the Templars followed a pattern similar to the earlier fall of the Merovingians. Sudden accusations, coordinated political pressure, and a systematic attempt to erase a group perceived as holding too much influence. Whether coincidental or symbolic, the parallel fascinated later generations, fueling theories that both groups were connected by an invisible thread of spiritual heritage. Moving into the Renaissance and early modern periods, we find evidence of individuals claiming to preserve fragments of ancient wisdom. Alchemists, mystics, and philosophical societies occasionally referenced the old kings or the first guardians of the European realms. These references were vague, often metaphorical, and difficult to interpret, but they reveal an undercurrent of belief that Europe possessed an older lineage of knowledge predating the Church's consolidation of power. This heritage was sometimes framed as philosophical rather than genealogical, a tradition of sacred kingship representing harmony between humanity, nature, and the divine. The Enlightenment, despite its rationalism, did not erase these ideas. Secret societies proliferated across the continent, many drawing inspiration from medieval and ancient symbolism. Some of these groups explicitly sought to reconnect with lost traditions. A few even claimed to possess documents tracing back to Merovingian custodianship. While these claims are almost certainly false, they demonstrate the enduring allure of the idea that certain truths survive in coded form, passed down through generations of initiates. The 19th century brought a new twist. Historical Romanticism rekindled interest in early medieval Europe. Writers, artists, and amateur historians began exploring Merovingian sites, excavating artifacts, and studying manuscripts. In the process, they encountered odd references, oblique mentions of guardians, cryptic notes about relics removed for safekeeping, or lists of families protecting the memory of the old kings. Most of these documents were unreliable, but their existence suggested that someone, at some point in history, believed in the continuity of Merovingian heritage. This era also produced the first explicit theories about clandestine organizations preserving Merovingian lineage. Whether these theories were grounded in fact or imagination hardly mattered. As the story of the Merovingians approaches its quiet conclusion, the question inevitably arises: what do these mysteries mean for the modern world? Why does a dynasty that vanished over 1,000 years ago still command fascination, spark conspiracy theories, inspire novels, and anchor some of the most enduring legends in Western imagination? The answer lies not merely in historical curiosity, but in a deeper longing for continuity, significance, and connection to an age when the world felt enchanted. When kingship was sacred, symbols mattered, and the veil between myth and reality was thinner than it is today. In the modern era, we inhabit a landscape of skepticism and rationality. We look to science for answers, to institutions for order, and to data for truth. Yet beneath this intellectual clarity, a quiet hunger persists, a desire to believe that history still contains hidden chapters, that not everything has been cataloged or explained. The Merovingians sit precisely in that liminal space between what is known and what is possible. They offer a gateway into a forgotten worldview, a world in which leaders were believed to embody the land itself, where bloodlines were intertwined with cosmic order, where symbols carried power, and where the spiritual and political realms were inseparable. It is this sense of mystery that draws modern minds back to the long-haired kings of Europe. They stand as a reminder that history is not only a record of events, but also an archive of meanings, interpretations, and lost perspectives. Their rituals, their symbols, their abrupt disappearance, and the murky silence that followed. All of it feels like the outline of a story never fully told. This is why the Merovingians have become a focal point for alternative historical narratives. They occupy a space where speculation flourishes because the surviving record leaves enough gaps to invite imagination. And the questions that arise about lineage, guardianship, sacred kingship, hidden knowledge are not just about them, but about us. They reflect our own uncertainty about the modern world and our yearning for connection to something ancient and enduring. The modern fascination intensified dramatically in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. Popular books, pseudo-historical theories, and fictional works began weaving the Merovingians into larger narratives about secret societies, sacred relics, and suppressed truths. These interpretations were often sensationalized, but their appeal was undeniable. In a world obsessed with transparency and information, the idea of an ancient lineage silently moving through history felt intoxicating. It suggested that there were still forces operating beyond public understanding, that the past still held secrets capable of reshaping the present. While most historians dismiss these ideas, even they acknowledge that the Merovingian era remains poorly understood, its sources biased, incomplete, or shaped by political agendas. The Carolingian takeover, recorded mostly by those who benefited from it, leaves open the possibility that key aspects of Merovingian culture or spirituality were deliberately erased. This makes the dynasty especially vulnerable to reinterpretation. When history speaks in fragments, imagination fills the gaps. Modern researchers attempting to reconstruct the truth face a complicated landscape. Archaeological discoveries at Merovingian burial sites occasionally reveal artifacts with unexplained symbols or unusual craftsmanship. Manuscripts from the era sometimes refer to rituals or customs without elaboration. Regional folklore in parts of France, Germany, and Belgium still contains echoes of long-haired kings who ruled not with armies alone, but with spiritual authority. These fragments are tantalizing because they feel incomplete, as though they are remnants of a much larger puzzle. In the realm of alternative history, this puzzle is often framed as part of a suppressed narrative. According to this perspective, the Merovingians represented a different kind of kingship, one rooted in symbolism, mystery, and continuity with pre-Christian spiritual traditions. Their fall was therefore not simply political, but ideological. The new order that replaced them, centered around the church and the Carolingian system, had no tolerance for a lineage that derived legitimacy from sources outside their control. In this interpretation, the disappearance of the Merovingians becomes part of a larger pattern in which ancient traditions were marginalized or reinterpreted to fit emerging structures of power. From a modern standpoint, whether or not this interpretation is accurate is almost secondary. What matters is that it resonates. The Merovingians serve as an emblem of everything that feels lost in the transition from the mythic worldview to the rational one. They evoke a time when societies still perceive themselves as part of a cosmic order, when leaders were not merely administrators, but symbols of collective identity. The idea that remnants of this worldview may have survived in hidden pockets across Europe adds romantic depth to their story. This helps explain why genealogical claims linked to the dynasty continue to surface today. Some families proudly maintain charts tracing their ancestry back to Merovingian princes or nobles. Whether these genealogies are fully accurate is difficult to verify, but the desire to trace one's identity to the cradle of European royalty speaks to a longing for connection to something foundational. The Merovingians represent a beginning, a doorway into the early medieval world where modern Europe first emerged. The esoteric associations that surround them in modern literature also reveal something important. The symbols tied to the dynasty, bees, crescents, lilies, sigils, continue to appear in art, alternative spiritual movements, and even fashion. They have become aesthetic touchstones, visual shorthand for mystery and lost heritage. The Merovingians, through these symbols, exert an influence far greater than their political achievements would suggest. In the digital age, this fascination has only intensified. Online communities dissect manuscripts, analyze heraldry, compare DNA studies, and propose new interpretations of archaeological finds. The Merovingians attract researchers from diverse backgrounds: historians, mystics, genealogists, artists, and curious enthusiasts. Some seek factual clarity, others seek meaning. All are drawn to the sense that the Merovingians represent a labyrinth of history, one that invites exploration rather than offering easy answers. Yet perhaps the most profound modern implication of their legacy lies not in conspiracy theories or sensational interpretations, but in the quiet realization that history is layered. Beneath the official narratives taught in textbooks lies a deeper, more complex web of memories, omissions, interpretations, and forgotten perspectives. The Merovingians remind us that the past is never fully settled. There are always stories left untold, threads left loose, and mysteries waiting for those willing to listen. Their tale becomes a meditation on how history is shaped, who records it, who edits it, who benefits from certain interpretations, and what gets left behind. The Merovingians are not simply ancient rulers. They're symbols of historical fragility, reminding us that much of what we believe about the past is shaped by power dynamics, lost documents, and selective memory. In this sense, the modern relevance of the Merovingians extends beyond genealogy or myth. They encourage us to approach history with humility, to recognize the gaps in our knowledge, and to remain open to the possibility that certain truths lie hidden beneath layers of revision. Their story invites us to embrace wonder without abandoning reason, to seek meaning without surrendering to fantasy. Ultimately, the Merovingians endure because they embody a paradox that speaks directly to the modern mind. They are both real and mythic, documented and mysterious, lost and yet profoundly present. They challenge us to rethink what it means for a lineage to survive. Is survival purely biological, measured through DNA and genealogy? Or is it cultural, symbolic, woven into the stories we tell and the values we preserve? In this broader sense, the Merovingians have indeed survived. They live on in legends, in art, in speculative research, in the imaginations of those who sense that history holds more than textbooks reveal. They endure because the human spirit demands stories that blend truth with wonder, memory with mystery. And perhaps this is their final legacy, not a political kingdom or an unbroken bloodline, but an invitation to remember that some mysteries are not meant to be solved completely, but carried forward generation to generation, as reminders that the world is deeper, older, and more enchanted than we often allow ourselves to believe.